like to thank you in advance for watching this video. So yeah, I'm going to be coming at you again this week with another top tips or 6 tips or collection of tips video. I like doing collections of tips, to be honest. I just enjoy them as a video format. This week, we're going to be talking about tanks. Now, I want to first of all start by saying I am no expert in the art of painting tanks, and I really do think it's kind of an art in its own form. Tank painting involves employing a lot of different tricks and, you know, little wear and tear effects and things that are very specific to painting tanks that you don't do very often in a lot of your other painting. Now, a lot of the techniques that said are transferable to things like, you know, dreadnoughts, battlesuits, you know, those bigger kind of big platey chunky miniatures. In my studying, in my sort of trying to learn how to get better at this sort of stuff, I think I've sort of gathered a nice little collection of techniques that apply predominantly to tanks and sort of to a lesser extent work with other stuff. So I'm going to pass those on to you. Hopefully you're going to like them. Let's make a start. Let's talk about tanks. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is panel modulation, which is a really complex sounding term, but actually it's a really simple thing. The basic process involves pushing blended highlights all the way across one panel in a way so that you get lots of kind of highlight meeting dark. And so what this does is when everything comes together and you've got all of these sort of light panels that meet dark panels, light panels that meet dark panels in every direction, it's not really a realistic way of lighting a tank, but it creates a really cool effect. Now, the easiest way to do this is definitely by masking the areas off with putty or tape and using an airbrush. It is by far easier, quicker to do that way. However, you can definitely achieve it just by using, you know, some glazes and being very patient, building up those blends across the panels. It would just take you a lot longer. Okay, let's talk about freehand now, and I'm actually going to break this down into 2 sort of separate little things because I do think they're quite different. First of all, I want to talk about simple freehand, and this is just the idea of adding, you know, a pop panel, some stripes, some basic shapes and geometry, that kind of thing, even something like camouflage patterning. These, if you stick with, you know, primary colours or a good complementary, something that really stands out, these can serve to just make something really pop, make it look a lot more complex than it is, add an area of visual interest, an area of detail that wouldn't otherwise be there, and that's really helpful overall for not only sort of making the tank just look more badass, I guess, but also it kind of helps tie in that military characteristic that you tend to associate with tanks anyway. And of course, from that simple freehand, it makes perfect sense to also consider moving on to maybe doing some more complex freehand. You have these big, wide open, flat areas on tanks, and that lends itself really well to just kind of doing something a bit more in the traditional art kind of form. So what I like to do when I do this is separate the piece, actually keep it removed from the model when I'm assembling, and I'll affix it to something flat, and I'll work on it as flat as possible so that I can treat it more like it's a normal 2D painting. That's going to really help you just be able to pull accurate lines and be able to see it a little bit better, that kind of thing. And then when you're finished with all of that, what you can then do is just fix it back to the miniature and just sort of work around it to blend it back into the main miniature itself. Sometimes you'll have to do a little bit of tidying up of base coating, or, you know, if you've got a weathering pattern there, you'll have to carry that across to it, that kind of thing. But it can produce some really effective and striking miniatures where you can paint an entire piece just to battle ready, and then you have that nice bit of freehand added to it that really elevates the whole thing, draws people's attention to it, and makes it look that little bit cooler. Okay, so here's one that will probably surprise you: dry brushed highlights. Not because you don't really associate them with tanks, because I think, you know, we've kind of all seen that sort of thing before, but the reason I'm including it in this list might be a little bit of a surprise. Those of you that follow my painting regularly and aware of the kind of methods that I teach, I tend to very seldom use dry brushing, and the reason I tend to very seldom use dry brushing is because it does produce a sort of slightly woolly kind of edge to everything. So all of those crisp lines, they will have just a slight bit of sort of fuzz to them, which personally I'm not a huge fan of in a lot of places. But that said, when it's context appropriate, adding those dry brush highlights and getting those kind of woolly lines and that sort of slightly fluffy feeling, actually on something like a tank, kind of helps push that feeling of wear, tear and battle damage. It makes the panels sort of look a little bit like they're scuffed at the edges, a little bit like they're a bit rough and ready, and that actually works fantastically in the context of painting a tank. So specifically when it comes to tanks, I really recommend you bust out the makeup brushes and try some dry brushing. Okay, the next one I'm going to call dirty weathering, because it's kind of a specific thing, or a specific group of things at least, and I think they all come together to do different but really cool things on tanks. So one of the things you can look at is maybe applying mud around the skirts of the tank. This is something you can do either just with an airbrush and some brown paint, and that's going to work really well. Or you could just sort of stab at it with a well-loaded kind of flat brush, and that's also still going to give you that nice kind of muddy effect. You could consider things like adding rust or watery tide marks into some of the sort of panel areas around rivets and bolts, that kind of thing, into those little nooks and crannies. That can look really effective. I like to do like a two-stage workup with a brown and then an orange to achieve that. Just thin them back really heavily and apply them into those panels, and that looks really great. The one final thing that you might want to consider having a go at is weathering powders. Now, I bought a cheap set of weathering powders. They were Revel branded, so they were for, for scale model hobby. And I picked them up off Amazon probably, I'm gonna guess, a year ago now, and I use them constantly. My entire Word Bearers army has been dusted with this yellow weathering powder to represent dust from sort of a sandy kind of desert planet, because the Word Bearers originally hail from a desert planet, and I wanted that kind of little tie back to Colchis. That was a sort of really cool way for me to create a little bit of story in amongst my army. And when you add them to tanks, these weathering powders, again, you can help create a story. You can tell sort of where the tank has been, what it's been doing. And these things last such a long time. Those weathering powders that I bought a year ago, the most empty of them is the yellow one that I've been using for my Word Bearers, and that's still more than half full. And finally, I want to talk to you now about battle damage, which is actually something that's often lumped in with weathering, but I think it's a very different discipline. Battle damage refers more specifically to adding, scratches, paint chips, bullet holes, the kind of stuff that shows that the machine has been through war. And you don't necessarily have to have battle damage if you've done weathering, and you don't necessarily have to have weathering if you've done battle damage. They do not have to go together. So I like to think of them as two separate techniques, because actually often using them separately, using them without relying on each other, can be a really cool way to tell a slightly different story. So for example, you can look at something like sponge chipping, where you dab a black or a dark brown paint around a piece, and that can be a really effective way of just creating a little bit of character. You can also look at bringing out some sort of rough scuffed metal on the edges, again either with a sponge if you wish, or with a paintbrush. There are a lot of different forms that battle damage can take, and I think you could probably chuck most of them into a tutorial of their own, because there's some really cool things you can do. Some of them involve physically damaging the miniature, maybe with a scalpel or a drill to represent bullet holes or big scratches and rents. But then at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that you can just do and make look really cool with a brush when it comes to effects for chipping and scratching as well. So battle damage is a really good idea, and it's definitely worth giving a shot. So what do you think of these tips for tanks, these top tips for tanky tactics? I really don't know. I don't know what to call it. I'd love to know what techniques you try, what techniques you like to apply when you're painting your tanks. So if you think that I've missed anything, or if you've got any sort of really bright ideas that you think are good suggestions for things to try on tanks, get at me in the comments and let's talk about it. If you like the video, of course, do remember to hit the thumbs up button to show me that you like it. If you want to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you do wish to support what I'm doing here and help pay the bills and keep the lights on, you can get at me on Patreon. There is a link in the description below, and I've got tiers starting from as little as $1 a month. Anyway, folks, that's all from me for this one. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.